Gemma Sugrue, welcome back to the Singing Teachers Talk podcast. It's lovely to actually finally meet you.
Yeah, lovely to meet you too. Thanks for having me.
We wanted to create a series of episodes dedicated to belting, and we spoke with John Henny for episode 101 about this very topic. So we want to get your thoughts on this today. You recently ran a 3-day Master Your Mix bootcamp, so we wanted to chat with you about those dreaded words, mix belt, all which makes us shrivel up like we've spent too long in the bath. So how do you define belt in the work that you do? And what's your relationship with it as a singer and as a vocal coach?
Okay, yeah. So belt as a term isn't as common in my particular work. Like for me, I kind of associate belting with what maybe a singer for hire might need to do or what a music theatre singer might need to do. Whereas a lot of my work, well, all of my work is with artists who are singer-songwriters. And so I think as a term, it's really useful for categorizing things in a certain industry, but with creative artists, it's kind of anything goes. But if for me, how I kind of view it or understand it is, or when I hear something or I hear a singer singing a note in a certain way that we might all kind of agree that's a belt. Usually it's quite a thick vocal fold closure. There's probably a ratio of high pressure. So there's a lot of air pressure underneath the fold. And then there's going to be a lot of upper partial activity. So in the harmonic spectrum, the frequencies, you're going to have a lot of activity higher up. And usually I hear them, like there are some outliers, but there's usually, they're singing an a vowel or an a with some kind of an quality to it is usually what a belt sounds like. Rarely, like I don't feel like when there's vibrato in there, because vibrato to me is the voice in a state of periodic rest, so it's more balanced. That to me wouldn't be like a belt. The vibrato will come in when they start tapering out of maybe that very strong, thick e vowel out into an e at the end to add the vibrato. But again, it doesn't because it's rare. It rarely comes up when you're working with artists. Mixed voice does come up more for sure. And I think we are probably talking about what other people might call belt as mix sometimes in our world.
So in your world, working with the people that you do, who do we know listening on the radio who might be using the belt that you're referring to?
I suppose there are loads of them are using it. I think the reason why we're not talking about it is because it doesn't matter the way that it matters in you need to have a belt for this audition, right? In pop, like Sia, for example, is, somebody who's a very high, thick vocal fold closure singer. So she's probably considered a belter, right? But she's not thinking about it in that way. She's not like, I want to really perfect my belt. I want to have a good belt. I'm a belter. She's probably never thinking about it in that way. Whereas somebody who's a music theatre singer is very much like, I'm a belter, I'm developing my belt. So I think it's more about like the context. There's plenty of it going on, but it's contextually, doesn't feel that relevant because we're not having to fit into categories.
How do you define mixed belt then? And you mentioned then about vibrato playing a role. And also, how do you define mix?
So I start with mix. I have had an up and down relationship, on-off relationship with mix for many years, since 2013. I think I might have figured out, like I was a classically trained singer, then got on YouTube and was like, oh, there's this thing called mix and I don't have it. I don't sound like that. What is that? I sing in my head voice all of the time. And so I started kind of getting into that and understanding a little bit more and understanding the world of contemporary singing. And then I started going to all these science conferences with Johan Sundberg and David Harris and Laurel Irene and Kerry Obert and all these amazing researchers and speakers on the voice who were just like, what, like mix? It's not, there's nothing scientifically grounding about that term. Like it could mean anything. It doesn't really matter what anyone calls that. That's not a thing, basically. And so then I became very dogmatic about nobody say mix, because it's not a thing. It doesn't even exist. Everything is always overlapping. Why would we even say this? And I started getting annoying then about that. And then I reformed and matured and understood that these are just words that are helpful, that are just a common language for people. And I think we all know what we mean when we say it. And let me get over myself for a minute and just use it again. And what for me mix is it's that it's basically singing higher with power in a balanced and controlled way. It's being able to manage resonances well, so be able to modify the vowel effectively. And there are certain vowels that are going to allow you to stay in a mix. It's being able to hand over effectively from the muscle, the thyroarytenoid, the bottom layer of the vocal fold, to the ligament. With the help of the cricothyroid to stretch the vocal folds. So it's a certain coordination of the vocal folds, and it's a certain management of air pressure versus air flow. And you're always kind of modulating these throughout your range. As the pitch changes, then the vowel is modifying slightly, because the pitch frequency is changing, then the frequency of the vowel is having to change to kind of adapt. And you're just, modifying the vocal tract shape, modifying the vocal fold closure, and modifying your pressure to flow throughout. And there's tons of options. And I just think that that's a very option. I kind of call it the option area. We've entered into the option area. Do we want to be thin? Do we want to be thick? Do we want to be bright? Do we want to be dark? What do we want to do here? And then you just become as kind of dynamic and as versatile as you can within that. But for me, a mix is anything that's connected, that's still in mode 1 of the vibratory pattern, that hasn't gone into mode 2, which is more of a disconnected falsetto sound. And we manipulate that with resonances and how much we want the vocal folds, how much depth we want in the vocal fold closure.
And how do we know when that's become a mixed belt?
It's not a term that I have used. So mixed belt, I presume, is like a thick mix. For me personally, how my voice will hand over, if I want to keep it as thick for as long as possible as I ascend without like pulling chest, I need to move into an shading around A flat 4. And then I need to move into like an shading around C5. And then I'm going to have to move into an shading up to the G sharp. So that's going to keep me thick for as long as possible. In terms of like, how do that's not something I've kind of defined before. What's like a thick, what was it, a mixed belt?
Do we have to define it? I mean, has this all become a little bit too prescriptive?
I think that it's really helpful for the music theatre audition people, because they are like, oh, that's a light mix or a mixed belt or all these different things. Whereas it hasn't, look, fortunately for the artistry stuff, we don't have to get that nuanced with the categorization. I just always ask them, do you like that? What would you like more of? What would you like less of? And we usually talk in terms of dark or bright, thick or thin.
I wonder whether, even for the musical theatre person, that using the intention, like you mentioned with Sia, using the intention of what you're trying to play out might be a really good way in, instead of trying to identify whether it's slightly thick or slightly thin or whatever, so that we're constantly thinking about character and the communication side of things, because the audience isn't really going to be sat there thinking, oh, that mix is slightly thinner than I wanted it to be. They're going to be thinking, goodness me, that character is really sad, or whatever's happening.
For me, there's definitely some resonancing or like resonance play that I'm engaging in that's a bit smoke and mirrors above my B5. Like, I'm not truly thick above my B5. I can manipulate it with the right vowel modifications, because I'm classically trained. It's been hard for me to kind of keep that depth of vocal fold closure engaged all the way up to whatever you might want to belt to an E5 or an F.
You've touched on some of the mechanics there, so I'd just be really interested to know how you get a singer, with the people that you work with, into these coordinations. So we know that singing isn't a linear process. There's lots of things being impacted from lots of different directions. So at the level of the vocal folds, how do you help a singer to keep a thicker fold? What's your favorite thing to do?
So we're talking about sound. And so my favorite way to train a singer is their listening. I want them to be able to be good at hearing sound before they're good at feeling sound. And I feel like a lot of the emphasis gets placed on feeling the sound, putting different body parts in different places that they don't have a huge amount of sensory awareness for. And I think if we can really help them develop their aural intelligence, their ability to hear sound more spectrally, then all the body parts will move into place accordingly. And a lot of this was kind of sparked in my mind when I first heard the researcher Heidi Moss speak about how we're, as a species, human beings are one of 8 species that are vocal learners, who our brains are wired for imitation. So where I will start usually is with them sounding. So not singing, sounding the note, so that we might sound it on a call like a hey or an oi or an oh yeah. And then I'm like, how does it feel? Do you have now a reference point? So we can do the feeling secondly, but we will do the imitation firstly. And then, so yeah, primal sounds, and then getting into, I suppose, putting that into a scale and locking that in and playing around with breaking the sound down spectrally. So that usually means doing the sound in a very bright way and then doing the sound in a very dark way, and then finding what we call the chiaro scuro, which is like your light and shade balance in that sound. So that's why diphthongs are really helpful, or like people will use my or nays or yas, because with like a yeah, you've got the bright and the e and the ah, or the thickness and the darkness in the ah, or it's not as bright as the e, basically. Ah is still quite a bright vowel. But a singer who tends to be very thick, I'm like, lean into the e a little bit more than the ah. A singer who tends to be quite thin, I'm like, let's sing into the ah a little bit more than the e. And so, yeah, I usually like to start with refining the engine first, which is what's happening up here in the vocal tract, before then adding the gas, which is what we're doing underneath with the power supply from the airflow.
And it sounds like you're using a lot of negative practice, feeling both ends of the spectrum so that you know where to shift your cursor.
Yeah, definitely love that. Love that. As much clarity that we can give them for context, for reference points, like you say, and then find your place on that continuum.
And you were mentioning about setting things up. So is there something that you feel needs to be in place first before you even delve into thickening up the folds for a belt?
Yeah, definitely. I usually will want the singer to be able to give me a really good quality mode 1 up to G4. I just like it, males that might be a little bit, or testosterone driven voices that might be a little bit too much of an extension, but for an estrogen driven voice up to G4, I want them to be able to sing all the vowels, be able to navigate through that octave well in their mode 1 in a speech dominant sound. And then I also want them to be able to access true falsetto. Like, it can be airy. I just need you to be off the voice, truly in falsetto, in like a ha, ha, ha. So they have access to that. And once we have those functional vibratory patterns available to us, then I'm happy to start manipulating resonances and manipulating things in the middle.
And you mentioned about the air pressures and the relationship there. How do you help somebody to feel that? Is that useful for them to understand pressure in their body and airflow in their body?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of my favorite ways for them to experience that is doing something like a blowfish, where they're really getting intimate with the idea of what Ken Bozeman calls transglottal pressure difference, where we have air pressure above, like supraglottally, so above the vocal folds, and we have pressure below the vocal folds, subglottally. And they're kind of in this interaction with each other, these two pressures. And when the singer does something like a blowfish with the thumb, and I get them to put their hand on their lower abdominal wall, just above their pubic bone, nice and low, and I get them to just do any siren like a, and I ask them, did they feel any engagement in their lower abdominal wall? They'll usually say yes. They haven't had to think about that or make that happen. That interacted with the pressure that was happening above the vocal folds. And now they've got that gateway into the experience of that. Now they can lean in more. Now they can play more with it, but they've gotten the trigger point for it without having to think and look. And I just get so worried about singers getting bogged down in support muscles and it becoming almost counteractive, that they tense up because the vocal folds, the larynx, everything is going to shut down if they get too tense. So letting the body naturally react and respond, and then we just start following that further.
So what might your views be on anchoring? I don't know if you've come across that term before. I know it through the grapevine from a still, and I understand it to be like imagining you have oranges underneath your armpits and kind of stabilizing into that, if you like.
So this is all about stability and getting the muscles that we use to stabilize us, usually muscles in the core, to get involved with the singing and to help us manage those changing air pressures. So as you sing, there's a different pressure quality or pressure level to each note you're singing, depending on the note that you're singing, depending on the vowel that you're singing. So the pressures are always undulating. So it's a good way to get in and manage it. But I prefer accessing it through movement, which I've learned from Chris Johnson, who I think is amazing. And I think his methodology, or so he wouldn't call it a methodology, but his approach with that is really useful and feels really organic. And one of my favorite things to get a singer to do is to march. And automatically the body is forced to engage stability muscles that are going to stabilize the body and keep you available for that movement that has a lot of variability in legs up and down, variability throughout the whole torso. So those muscles are getting engaged. And if you're having to sing with that engagement, it's really connecting, kind of joining those dots up. And it's quite challenging for the singer as well, but can get the singer into the body a little bit more. But I think it's a whole, like from the bottom, it's a bottom up experience. And I'm starting to get into that now myself. I like to go to the gym, I like to work out, and I actually spent an hour yesterday just stepping up properly, like trying to make sure that the middle of my foot gets on a step before my heel touches the step. And I spent like an hour just obsessing over that. And I started wearing those Vivo barefoot shoes, because like I have toes on my feet that are absolute passengers on the ride. They're not doing any work. And I was like, I have to, they're important. Like I have those toes for a reason. I can't even move them. And I think all of that, that's why, physical work, strength work, stability work, Feldenkrais, Alexander technique, all of that stuff is going to make you a great singer. But treat yourself as a kind of a whole person, a whole body, and all of it is going to kind of support and help you be better.
In your view, where are we going to need the larynx? Do we need to worry about the larynx when we're looking at mix and belting? Will it just follow what we're doing? Do we need it high? Do we need it low? What do you think?
I think it's not something that comes up for me as an instruction often, because it's hard to separate everything from each other. Like I find that hard. Others don't, but I do. I find because when I'm talking about the larynx, I'm also talking about tongue position, and I'm also talking about the vowel, and I'm also talking about the soft palate position, and I'm also talking about the quality of vocal fold closure. So it's really hard to separate them out. For me, I want the singer, you can definitely hear some singers tend towards maybe too low of a larynx, and it's not helpful for them because they're not getting enough brighter upper partial frequencies to help them with power. And then you do hear some singers who are a little bit tight sounding and the larynx rides a little bit too high. So in general, we want it Goldilocks. We want it to be somewhere that's nice and relaxed and natural for them, right? But beyond that, we want a larynx that's on the move. And that's what really amazing singers, it's one of the reasons we love a singer. A singer sounds really musical is because they're in one sentence, they've had a very low to very high larynx position just in one sentence in their chest voice. And that's what gave it so much color and a lot of dynamic. So generally it's on the move, and I don't talk about it unless there's a distinct problem. And it's always in context of the tongue position and the vowel usually.
Then let's talk about the tongue and the articulators. Where do you like to influence the tongue to be when we're belting or when we're in a mixy quality?
I think that it's good to have an awareness of where the tongue, so you want the tongue resting on the roof of the mouth. And so I would start there with the singer being aware that their tongue should be resting on the roof of the mouth. There's been amazing work done by a coach and researcher, Andrew Byrne, and he talks about practicing with the tongue on the spot, so being at the roof of the mouth. So starting there. He also talks about like the innervation of the tongue and like using a tongue scraper, like a cleaner, to kind of wake up all the different parts of the tongue. I love how Kerry Obert, of course, talks about the tongue and how it's the hydrostat. It's like an elephant's trunk and it's got like so many positions it can go into. And we need to not think about it as a problematic part of the anatomy. It's like the most amazing, fabulous, creative part of the anatomy. It can go into so many different positions. Something that I also love doing is getting a singer to be aware of the position by breathing in on the vowel and noticing where they feel the cold air in their vocal tract. So if I was to breathe in on an oo vowel, so if I just breathe in on an oo vowel like this, I will feel the cold air hitting the front of my tongue and kind of being up here at the front. So this is where the oo vowel is, the formation is very important, right? And I'm also getting to experience where my tongue went for the oo vowel to create the oo vowel. And then if I'm getting them to really experience what the true ah vowel, and then I'll get them to do the exact same thing, that they breathe in on the ah, and they'll feel that a lot of the air is hitting the back of the throat. So rather than, I worry about getting them to put the tongue into too much of a position again. Like generally, yeah, high is going to be helpful, having the tip towards the front. Sometimes we want to use a bit of root ring and have some of the tongue moving back into the throat space. But I try to let all of that be guided by the sound, so the imitation of the sound, and that they're listening to that, and that so that they don't feel fixed in a positioning. But that when we have the sound and we like the sound, we're like, that's the sound. You like that sound? I like that sound. Okay, now think about where your tongue is. Then we think about where the tongue is after that.
Yeah, I like that. So do you find that's a little bit more helpful than giving an instruction like raise your tongue a little bit, push your tongue a little bit more forwards, but instead getting them to reference the sound that they were able to imitate through play,
Yeah,
and be able to recreate it?
yeah. And so again, I think it's this idea that I seem to be following recently of the primary instruction is aural, and then the secondary kind of finisher is a sensory thing. And I'm sort of like, okay, I like the ballpark we're in now with that avo. Can I just hear it with the tongue forward a little bit more? Can I just hear it with you raising? So I will start maybe doing some tweaks like that. Like, you know, an E vowel is a very extreme, nice high tongue position. I even get them to feel the sides of the tongue on the top molars. And I think that can be a really great one to warm the voice up or to kind of prime the voice before we go and do something like an ah vowel, like a belted ah. Sometimes just borrowing some frequencies from some of the higher vowels can be nice, and they usually have that higher tongue position.
Have you come across something called the belter's bite?
No, tell me about that.
So the belter's bite, which I've heard described by Lise Popeil, talks about having a slightly raised head, activating the chewing muscles for a firm but flexible jaw, no lower teeth showing, cheeks raised and wide, the tongue relaxed in the mouth, tip of the tongue against the bottom teeth, and a slightly protruded chin. Sounds like quite a lot to remember.
It's a lot to remember, yeah. I think it's because, you know, you just tend to teach in the way that your brain works as well. For me, the students that would just like, yes, give me like all these little specific postures to put my body into, and I will do that. I can't, that doesn't click for me as well. Like the micromanagement of the different parts things tend to fall apart for me as a singer. So then I've gotten out of I don't tend to teach like that because of that. So for somebody else, that's going to work really well. But I think, yeah, I've become so into being good at hearing the sound and teaching that's just become my way.
And you mentioned earlier about, that to a certain point you're going to need a bit of an R vowel compared to a little bit higher up when it's an air and then more of an ah. How did you find that out for yourself? And how do you help singers find out which vowel is going to help them best?
Okay, starting with how I figured it out was from pausing singers mid note. So I would listen to a singer, and as soon as I would just like constantly pause the note as they were singing it, and I'm like, oh, it's a, and I'm like, oh, okay. So she starts after the W, she's like got an and then it moves into like an and she holds it on the and then she starts tapering it out into an E, and then she goes vibrato at the end. And I'm like, okay, so it's that So then I go rewind into the and I'm like, okay, this is that vowel. So this is like listening to long notes sung by like Jessie J or Whitney Houston or Beyonce or something like that. And so I just started breaking down the sounds in that way, and then trying to do them in my own voice, trying to experience how I could hang on to that thickness without what you had John Henny on. One of the things that he said that I absolutely loved was he was talking about how, your nervous system, and Ken Bozeman talks about this as well. Your nervous system has these go-to like yell mode or the whoop timbre that Ken Bozeman talks about. Being in a belt or being in a mix is about kind of sneaking past those nervous system defaults, like tricking your body past them. So I think I'm always just trying to kind of ride that fine line of staying in that thickness without going into that yell mode and tricking my way out of it. But yeah, it's been, and I found that through vowel modification, through understanding singers that I wanted to sound more like. But then in terms of teaching that to singers and helping them figure out, because it's, we unfortunately can't just take exactly what Whitney Houston did and input it into your vocal tract. There's going to be different things that your vocal tract is going to need and want to do and gravitate towards and work better with. So I like to audition different vowels. So I'll just go through there's like a bunch of sounds that I want to audition them through. I'll cycle them through and I'm asking them, how does that feel? How do we like that? And then we kind of go, okay, which one was our favorite? I think we like da-da-da. Okay, let's do that then. And then we make up an exercise for the phrase with those two vowels that we might have selected.
Love it. Can you talk a little bit about twang and how you implement that?
Yeah, ain't nothing but a twang thing. I love twang for life. Twang is everything. I can't say enough good things about twang. It's free power for the voice. I think when I learned that the human ear canal is tuned to boost around 2,500 frequencies to 4,000 frequencies, which is like the region generally we would consider to be the twang region. I was like, oh yeah, it's just free power. It's free volume. And then it works as free energy that gets sent back to the vocal folds that helps them vibrate better, which takes the pressure off them, takes the pressure off the muscles. And it just, it's an unfinished sound, which is a term taken from John Henny, just to give him credit on that. It's like an unfinished, on its own, not the cutest sound, but with like the depth and body of some or some darker sounds within that, or like in the whole spectrum, in the whole frequency spectrum. It's amazing. So yeah, like when you look at like what a falsetto looks like on the spectrogram analyzer in comparison to what like chest or belt or mix looks like, it's just like a sound with very little twang and then a sound with plenty of twang. And that they're kind of like that's like one of the biggest differences you will see in those singing qualities on the spectrum analyzer.
How do you like to help singers get into a twang that can assist them to find that power?
Yeah. First of all, I have to get them on board with liking it as much as I do and being like totally sold on it. Mm-hmm. Then we talk about twang not needing to be nasal. It can be nasalized, but it doesn't have to be. And we practice singing it nasal and non-nasal, usually with a nose block where I get them to do the negative and positive, like we've talked about, like a and then I ask them, what do you notice about the vocal tract when you do that? And they're like, oh, I notice that the tongue goes up and back, and I notice that the palate comes down, and all the sound is kind of happening here at the back. And I'm like, yeah, so your brain was like, don't let any of the sound go into the oral cavity, make sure it's all going into the nose. And so we're like, okay, so that's a nasally twang sound. Now, can you continue to have a bright sound without it being nasal? But I still want that, yeah. And they'll give me a yeah. And I'm like, great. So that was a sound that was in the oral cavity. It stayed bright and it was still twangy. So then we have those, once we've that kind of worked out, and it's not that I'm demonizing nasal either. I just want them to be able to decouple a twang from nasal. Then we will work on, what would we work on next? Yeah, I mean, just doing like silly sounds, like doing Janet from Friends and all of that. Oh my God. And yeah sounds. And then working on, or I use like a prompt, like be cartoony. I find that can be a good prompt. There's also whine and whinge that can come into it too. Or I'd use like an example of like Stevie Wonder. So I'm always using aural examples of things and lots of primal soundings of things.
Have you ever had it where you've been working with a young singer, 18, 19 maybe, and you mention something like Janice from Friends, and they're like, what's Friends? I'm like, how have we crossed paths?
I know. And yeah, it's, what would I say instead? Like kind of whiny, whingy. I know that kind of gets you into a little bit of a different sound, but yeah, like out of schoolyard, na 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 na, or even just going like hyper, like character New Yorky, or if they're like music theater, they know anything about music theater, then I might get them to do what's that, Adelaide's Lament or something like that. But I think once I can demonstrate it, they get it.
Yeah. What would be the exercise that you would go to for belting?
For me, the vowel that's the thickest for me is eh. Nothing is as thick as my eh vowel. I find that my ah thins out a bit, and my I just can't take that high. But my eh, I can go quite high and I can stay quite thick. So I like a yeah. I have the brightness off the E into the yeah, and I can make it more than or I can make it more than depending on what the singer needs. But I like, usually I might do like a primal sound where I'll get them to go, oh yeah. I'm like, yeah. And then we'll do like, I hope my microphone isn't peaking too much, but we'll do that like repeated octave at the top where we're yeah. And I might ask them, okay, can I get more E in that? They might be too yeah. I'm like, that's a bit dull. Can I get a lot of E in it? Yeah. And make it a bit cartoony for me. Yeah. And then it might get a little bit too thin where we're like, yeah. And I'm like, oh, it's gone a bit too thin. Give me more of the yeah. And that, once we get that sound in the right ballpark, then we can start talking about, can you drop your jaw a little bit more every time we get into the Can you allow the tongue to roll forward a little bit more? And we can start playing with some of the moving parts. But I want to get the ballpark of the sound first, and I play around with the chiaroscuro of the brightness of the E and the thickness, heaviness of the
If there was one myth that you could bust about mix and or belt, what would it be?
I think, oh gosh, what would it be? I suppose that it's not a destination. It's and it's different people interpret it in different ways. And it's quite a gray area. But I think, the main thing is like it's not a vocal register. It's much more of an acoustic event. And we're manipulating the acoustics accordingly, but it's not a laryngeal register, I think is an important thing for people to note.
You've mentioned the work of John Henny, a bit of Ken Bozeman's work, Kerry Obert. Is there anybody else that you would recommend us checking out on this topic?
Chris Johnson. I love like everybody all people should know Ian Davidson. He's one of my favorite vocal coaches. I think Dave Stroud is one of my favorite teachers as well. I adore watching him masterclass. I feel like if I say, it's like doing an Oscar thing that like, if I say too many people, then I've excluded people. Oh, if you haven't used the website voicescienceworks.org, you are missing out on the most amazing free voice science resource on the internet. It's created by David Harris and Laurel Irene. They explain stuff that is so complicated, so beautifully, so well. So that's my recommendation. These are my top pick. David Harris, Laurel Irene, voicescienceworks.org.
Gemma Sugrue, there is no denying that the content that you create for your social media is incredibly engaging. What has been the process for you finding the best way to create this content and speak to your audience?
I think it's been having a laugh. And it's advice I give my students. I'm like, do it for a laugh. Like, make a thing for the laugh. Like, as in just be lighthearted about it. Stop taking yourself. I think I took myself too seriously for a while when I started getting into the voice science stuff, and I was like, I'm a vocalogist, even though that's not even a thing. I'm like, I'm so into the science. And I lost touch with the whole point of teaching, which is being a good communicator. And when I got into TikTok, that took a lot of the pressure off of me about how the content need to come across. Because when I'm on Instagram, I'm thinking about my peers, I'm thinking about my family, I'm thinking about my friends. All of these people are going to be judging me, and who, I've built up this reputation and I need to be this thing, whatever. Get into TikTok and I'm just like, nobody cares, nobody knows me. I'm just going to make whatever I want here and have a bit of fun with it. And then turned out that was the thing that everybody resonated with, everybody seemed to click with. And then I started reposting it on my Instagram. I would have never have made those videos for Instagram. No way, I would have died. And then once I made them over there and they were popular, I was like, well, it's been validated. People like it here, so I'm going to put it on Instagram now. So yeah, I think realizing that, just being yourself, and also being okay with not being liked, which is, initially is hard, but then you're like, well, I don't like everybody either, so that makes sense. So it's fine. So yeah, TikTok was amazing for me to kind of free me and allow me to just express myself and be myself as a teacher online.
And have you had any trolling or bad comments? And if so, how have you dealt with those?
Yeah, loads of people, not loads. See, it feels like it's loads, like it's like 1% of the comments, but to you, it feels like 100% when you see one bad comment. But a lot of people misunderstand that I'm doing some of my content is like, satirical. I'm pretending to be this really mean vocal coach. And, so some people didn't realize it was a joke. But then you're just like, initially it was hard, and then you start getting used to it, and it's good for your ego. It definitely is good for your ego. And I think coming back to that sentiment that, like, when I'm really honest with myself, I don't like everybody. So then me expecting everybody to like me seems unreasonable. And then you just get okay with not being liked. And then you start actually feeling more confident than you were before, because you're like, I know people who don't like me and I'm still cool with it myself. And then you're like, oh, this is a different level of confidence.
You've explored stand-up comedy recently. What got you into that? And has that helped you create any of this content?
Yeah, definitely. It's really, I think it has been good for me again with that, like, stand-up comedy is immediate feedback. Like, people are either going to laugh or they're not going to laugh. You can sing and people can think that you were good or you were bad, but you will never know. You know immediately that you were bad when you're doing stand-up comedy, or you know immediately that you're good. So that's a really good training ground for dealing with that. But it's also just a great way to find, because all we're trying to do is communicate as teachers. We're just trying to communicate ideas, and comedy is such a creative way to communicate. And like, the other thing you're also trying to find is a match between you and a student. You are trying to find a personality match. And if you think about like dating, most people will say, I want a guy or I want a girl with a sense of humor. What you're really saying is, I want somebody who thinks the same things are funny that I think are funny. So it's like a bonding thing as well. So any singer that comes on a call with me that asking about my program, I'm just like, immediately we're friends, because they know me, they get what I think is funny, and we've already got a connection before we've even met. So it's been a really cool way of connecting with the right fit of students.
What would be your bit of advice to fellow vocal coaches to get started on things like YouTube and Instagram and TikTok?
I definitely recommend starting on a platform where nobody knows you and you're being pushed out to new people all the time, so the data that you're getting back is very clean. It's hard to see the wood from the trees when you're just getting all of the support from your family and friends on your Instagram or on your Facebook, and sometimes you can feel like, oh no, it's okay guys, you don't have to comment, and you might feel a little bit, oh, Morto posting a thing again and they're going to get sick of me. Right, go over to TikTok where it's like a clean, fresh slate, or shorts on YouTube is also like works as well as TikTok, not as well, but nearly as well. And you're going to get a lot of coverage. It's, have potential to go viral, but go there, take it lightheartedly, and don't be afraid to, it sounds like generic advice, but do not be afraid to be yourself, and don't take yourself too seriously, and just talk to the camera in the exact same way that you talk to your student, in the exact same way that you would connect to a student in a lesson. And people will love it.
How long has it all taken you to kind of find your feet with it?
A long time, definitely a long time. I feel like I've only really clicked with things in the last year, and that's come from being like very consistent, like very determined about it. But like I've been all over the map up until then, and I think that there's like that. Everyone should accept that there's going to be an explore phase and an exploit phase. And I had a long explore phase where I'm like, I'm a singer, I'm a scientist, I'm very serious, I'm not serious at all. Like figuring all of that out, and then landing somewhere being like, this is me now, and this is how I like to be. And also not, I think you can tell when somebody's not excited about what they're talking about on a video. So I don't force myself to like, have to do the trend or have to do the da-da-da. I'm like, I'll just talk about what's fascinating me right now. And that's, I have parameters, all right, but I just allow myself to be kind of genuine and show up and talk about what's fascinating me. Yeah, but it has taken time to figure out where to land there.
And just before we let you go, can you tell us about Pro Vocal Artist? What's going on over there at the moment?
Yeah, so I have a company called Pro Vocal Artist, which is an online coaching community mastermind program that's about helping singers go from being singers to being artists. So helping them with their voice, with their songwriting, with their recording, using DAW as in Logic or whatever production tool they want to use, finding a producer, figuring out how to market themselves online and show up on social media, and just get to that place where they're releasing music that they're super proud of and they're confident about. And my mission I've figured out is helping people get new music into the world and helping singers be artists and explore that. And because I think that was always my dream, and I got lost in lots of different twists and turns along the way. So now my new dream is helping singers do that. So that's what we do at Pro Vocal Artist.
Amazing. And where can people find out more about that and get in touch with you?
So provocalartist.com.
Amazing. Gemma Sugrue, thank you so much for joining me today. I've really loved being with you.
Thank you so much, Lexa.